I want to, so this is a special luncheon that we're doing with the press club, the Milwaukee Press Club, reviewing the most unusual elections that we had, a two-part election on April 7 with the results on Monday. So I first of all want to thank the press club. Thanks to Gene Miller and Joette Richards, who helped put this together. And I want to tell you a little bit how we're going to proceed. But first, I want to thank all the sponsors. The press club sponsors include Spectrum News One and Moore Communications, and the WisPolitics.com sponsors for the Milwaukee event series include Waggett, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Medical College of Wisconsin, Milwaukee Police Association, the Firm Consulting, and Spectrum. So this is how it's going to work today. We're going to have a panel of three great journalists from the Milwaukee area. We're going to do the questions, and then I'll come in at the end with some audience questions. So I want to introduce our journalists, and then I'll introduce our guests who will help us with this program today. So first off, Craig Gilbert from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Thank you, Craig.
Good to be with you.
Adrian Peterson, who is with WISN and the host of the Upfront show that you can see on Sundays.
Thank you for having me.
Charles Benson from TMJ4 in Milwaukee. Thanks, Charles.
What's for lunch? Are you sending Grubhub over?
We'll work on that. That should have been in your contract.
Yeah.
And now we're going to now introduce the two state party chairs. They're relatively new in the job, but they're already battle tested, and both parties were very, very involved in what is formally a nonpartisan spring election, but it is very partisan these days. And so I want to introduce Andrew Hitt, who is the state GOP chair. Thank you, Andrew.
Great to be with you, Jeff, and great to be with everybody.
And Ben Wikler, who is the state Democratic Party chairman. Thanks very much for being with us, Ben.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's good to see you, Andrew, and thanks to all of our great journalist panelists.
Okay, so we're going to start the program and kick it off to Craig, who will ask the first question, and then I'll see you back about 12:50 with some audience questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff. So we just had this very chaotic and unusual election with a lot of people outside Wisconsin looking on in either fascination or dread. What does this election tell us about how we should be conducting the November election? Let's start with Ben and then go to Andrew.
The number one thing that we learned from the election just now is that we should make absentee voting, voting by mail, safely from home, available to every voter in Wisconsin for the May 12th election, for the August 11th primary, and for November 3rd. There is no reason to force people to choose between their health and safety and their ballot. And I can say I'm going to spend the next 6 months trying to help every person who's ready to vote against Trump get an absentee ballot into their hands. But I think this should be for everyone. And I would really urge my friend Andrew on the Republican side to work with his party leaders to reach an accord. I frankly don't know whether it helps Democrats or Republicans more to mail a ballot to every registered voter. I know there are logistical hurdles, but we can get through those. We are Wisconsin. We can do things. We should do that. We don't know how many people got infected on April 7th, but one is too many. This is something that we can and should follow the lead of red states like Ohio and blue states like California, and do while we have the time right now to make this election safe.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, my concern, and I've said this before, is that I don't think that going to all mail to mail all registered voters a ballot, I don't think our system is set up for it. I don't think our rules, our regulations are set up for it. My understanding is that states that have converted to this, it's taken many months, if not over a year, to kind of get things set up. I completely agree, though, with Ben, that we need to make sure that people can get absentee ballots. We need to encourage it. I think both parties, I know both parties, really encouraged it. We did videos teaching people how to get an absentee ballot, videos how to upload an ID. And so I think, those are all good things. We do need to see some results and some response from the postal system, because clearly something went wrong there. And I'm sure both Ben and I are very concerned about that. I was really happy to see both senators, bipartisan, ask for investigation or ask for some answers. I think we need that, because we can't have something like that happen. Having something like that happen, though, also makes me worried about going to this all mail system. I just worry that it's not ready for it. The last thing I would say is just caution. I mean, in a time of crisis, changing how we vote really, just deep down, it concerns me. It is central to our democracy and our freedoms. And I think we just have to be very careful about that. But I agree with planning and effort. We can do a lot of things to be prepared. And we saw how well our clerks did and our local governments did all over Wisconsin. I'm saddened that the national media reported only on the long lines in Milwaukee, because that wasn't what actually happened in the state. We had some issues in Milwaukee and Green Bay because of local decisions, but that wasn't the norm.
Adrian?
Going off of that last question, there's a new proposal in the city of Milwaukee from incoming Alderwoman Marina Dmitrievich to mail absentee ballot applications to all registered voters. And I want to know if you support that. So Andrew, you could start first.
Well, if we're going to do something like that, I think it needs to be uniform. I know that as a state party, we did that. We targeted high propensity voters over 60 years old in this last election, and we sent them absentee ballot applications. And, as a party, I think it's great. We should use those tools. We should use that strategy. I'm sure Ben probably did the same or something similar. But my concern is if we're going to have that, it needs to be uniform, and not just one county does it and one municipality does it or not, because I think then we have a situation where probably municipalities with more money or counties with bigger budgets, more staff can handle that, whereas rural areas outstate don't. And I would worry significantly about that.
So you'd be in favor of making that statewide?
If it was statewide, if it was funded statewide, it makes it more palatable. But just having one-offs do it, I would be very concerned about that. I think the parties have done a good job at that. We certainly took advantage of doing that. It's been a strategy that I think a lot of parties, or both parties, has used for a while. So I suppose my inclination is to continue to let Ben and I battle it out, sending those. But, if it was statewide, that would at a minimum have to be what was done.
Ben, what do you think?
So I think, Democrats have a partisan advantage if it comes down to organizing. And we just saw the result of a massive organizing drive on both sides. And I think Democrats demonstrated an edge in working to get absentee ballots into the hands of people, even with the current rules. But from the perspective of democracy, I do think, I think we should send people ballots, not just the form to request a ballot with a photocopy that a lot of people aren't in a position to make of their voter ID. But at the very least, we should send them absentee ballot applications. And if the Republicans in our state legislature won't act to make it easier for people to vote absentee, I think just from a public health perspective, it makes sense for municipalities to do that. I absolutely applaud Alder-elect Dmitrievich's proposal to do that in Milwaukee. We just need to make democracy safe. That's the bottom line. And I'm terrified to find out how many people contracted COVID-19 at the polls on April 7th. We know in Florida and in Illinois, there were poll workers who had coronavirus who came down with symptoms after the election. They had to mail notices to all the people that voted in their precinct to tell them that they may have been exposed and that they should quarantine themselves. And if I could go back in time, I would just do anything to try to make sure that we didn't have an in-person election on April 7th. Waukesha also had only a single polling place in the city of 70,000 people. Obviously, the rates of people's fear about coronavirus varied from place to place as the epidemic hit in different places at different rates. So Milwaukee had a massive, massive poll worker shortfall. But the images across the country of seeing voters, disproportionately African American and Latino voters, waiting in line, sometimes with oxygen tanks, canes, masks, trying to cast their ballot, even if it might expose them to this deadly virus. That was heartbreaking. That is just something we should not repeat. We shouldn't repeat it in northern Wisconsin on May 12th. We shouldn't repeat it on November 3rd.
Charles, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Let's talk about the election. And on Monday, we heard Democrats talking about voter suppression on steroids. I think that was the quote from the DNC chair. And then we heard Republicans saying Democrats were trying to rig the system by creating this confusion over the date and confusion on when the election would happen. So give me your perspective today on who won the absentee ballot battle, and what was the eventual fallout here? We'll start with Ben, I guess.
Sure. The highest rate of absentee voting in the state of Wisconsin was in Milwaukee. 87% of ballots cast were absentee. And I have just enormous regard for all the people, both civil servants and volunteers and voters and organizers who poured themselves into making that happen. What we found at the Democratic Party, we were running a huge organizing operation, a virtual organizing operation, making call after call. And what we found is voters who believed intensely that their vote was sacred. They would do anything they could to vote. Some people didn't know how to take phones. I hope that the video that you made, Andrew, was helpful. We were using videos, we were using FaceTime calls, we were using whatever we could. For a lot of people, there was an insurmountable barrier to getting a photo uploaded. And that's one reason why we went to court, to try to enfranchise everyone. But nonetheless, what we saw was a fundamental, profound shift in how people voted in the middle of coronavirus. And I think that the numbers bear out that the edge was on the Democratic side. But in terms of changing how we vote in the middle of a crisis, that was going to happen with or without our intervention, because people are scared, rightly so, of getting infected. So the question is, can our laws catch up with the reality on the ground rather than putting hurdles in people's way as they try to do the right thing to protect their health? I think we learned a template for how to do vote by mail organizing in the state for the first time at this scale that is going to help carry us through to November. But it's time for our laws to catch up with the reality of the biology of this virus and of the very real concern that people have about exposing themselves.
Andrew.
Thanks, Charles. So, I mean, let's take a step back and remember that we had a Democrat primary. About over 900,000 people voted in that primary for the Democrats. About 630,000 voted for the president. I'm not ready to concede, Ben, that you guys have a better organizing or a better ground game. I was very happy with what we did and how fast we adapted. We all had to adapt to virtual. But the reality is that we had a Democrat primary on their side. Bernie Sanders stayed in the race. His advisors admitted in the New York Times that part of the reason he stayed in the race was to help out Jill Karofsky. I don't know if Ben pulled that off or somebody else did, but I would say hats off to you for that. Because Bernie Sanders got nearly 300,000 votes and dropped out the next day when we didn't even have results for 6 days. So clearly there was this advantage on the Democrat side. We always knew that it was an uphill battle to keep Justice Kelly, not insurmountable. Many people wrote off Justice Hagedorn last year. And so I was very quick to point out to people, the same people who are writing off Justice Hagedorn are, you shouldn't write off Justice Kelly. But at the end of the day, clearly the numbers show and the turnout shows that that Dem primary was the driving force in this election.
Let me ask about one particular set of voting patterns we saw in this election that echoed voting patterns we saw in the midterms in 2018 and the presidential race of 2016, which is, we have a fascination with the wow counties, the famous wow counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, that have been for so long so lopsided, so mobilized, and delivered these massive Republican or conservative landslides in judicial races and in partisan races. in these latest races, we've seen kind of a softening of those margins. We saw it for president. We saw it for Governor Walker in 2018. We saw it in this court race. And they're no longer the three most Republican counties in Wisconsin. Obviously, other things have happened elsewhere in the state, maybe to counter that. But first with Andrew, I mean, what's your level of concern about what's happening in those Republican suburban communities? Are you worried that they're going to follow the path of suburbs in other large metropolitan areas and shift away from the Republican Party over time?
Yeah, well, certainly we're very closely focused on that. We've got some great organizing going on in those counties. Obviously we saw slippage in the margins in the net ballots or net votes cast this election in the WOW counties. We also saw that in Brown County as well. But raw numbers, Dan Kelly did better than Brian Hagedorn. So we're paying attention to that. I think it's going to be a very different, though, electorate in the fall. As you know, Craig, we had about 1.5 million. We're going to have twice that, almost 3 million people voting in the fall election. It's very different when the president is head to head on the ballot. And that will be a very different situation, a very different electorate. So I'm confident in what we're doing in the WOW counties. I think we've got good organizing. We've got a good ground game going there. It was obviously not enough to overcome, having this Dem presidential primary with, Bernie Sanders sticking in the race just to help out Karofsky.
Ben, if you could respond to that, but also maybe touch on what's been an area of weakness and vulnerability for the Democratic Party, which is kind of an erosion of strength in rural Wisconsin and in much of northern and western Wisconsin, and whether there are any takeaways for you in this election or in other recent elections with respect to both those parts of the state.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to, Andrew, encourage you strongly to do what you're describing and stick with the exact organizing model that you used in the Supreme Court race just now. I think that's a great template for the Republicans for the fall. And, we are learning lessons from this election as well.
I'll do that.
When you look at the numbers that just came out, I think you really see a kind of direct rejection of Donald Trump personally. Trump made the Supreme Court election about himself. He endorsed InPerson in Wisconsin in January. He tweeted multiple times, go out and vote for Dan Kelly. He talked about it in the coronavirus press briefing, which was astonishing to me that President Trump would take time away from managing coronavirus response to tune into a Wisconsin Supreme Court race. And then not only did Dan Kelly lose in a landslide, but Trump did worse than Dan Kelly. He got about 75,000 votes fewer. So there were conservatives who were coming out, and we saw in our polling that conservatives knew exactly who the conservative Supreme Court candidate was. There were people coming out, casting a ballot for Dan Kelly, and not voting for Trump. There was no such shortfall on the Democratic side. And I think that's a bright red alert for Trump in Wisconsin for November to see that he underperformed a Supreme Court candidate in our state who himself lost by 10 points. When you look at the WOW counties, you saw high turnout. And before we saw the final results, there was a question, would that high turnout counterbalance the high turnout in Madison, Milwaukee, other Democratic strongholds? It turns out that the high turnout was caused by a surge of Democratic voters in the WOW counties and in the BOW counties, Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago. So in April, the Bow Wow counties were the Republican dog that didn't bark. They didn't turn out the votes that Republicans needed to generate the win. In rural areas, we saw a marked shift. There were thousands and thousands of voters in places that used to be ultra deep red that were moving in a purple direction. And I can only speculate that that comes from a rural crisis in our state that was horrific even before coronavirus hit and now is reaching catastrophic proportions. There's a sense that Trump fundamentally is not working out for rural voters in Wisconsin. And we are hearing when we call and text people that they're ready for a change. And we saw that happen on April 7th in a way that I think sets up Democrats well for a change in the fall. We've invested more effort, more of our finances, more of our organizing time more of our data and outreach in rural areas than ever before. And what we're finding is a group of people who are ready and receptive for a message about change.
So I want to ask you two different questions here. So Andrew, I want to know from you if the party at all regrets going ahead and having the in-person election on April 7th, especially considering not getting the Supreme Court seat. And do you think having that in-person election affected the results at all?
Well, first of all, I had said all along here, there's two ways that this election can occur constitutionally. One, the legislature and the governor can change the date, or we can follow all the rules and all the laws and not change them in the middle of a crisis. That's why I fought back in every court case. That's why I filed a suit in the Wisconsin Supreme Court in an original action. Felt very strongly that those two things, one of two options could take place. Now, the timeline just doesn't match the rhetoric and the blame game that the Democrats have put forward. We have to remember that 3 weeks out, Governor Evers was calling for no change to the election. The DNC was calling for states to not move their primaries. It wasn't until April that the DNC changed their convention, and now all of a sudden Governor Evers was willing to change the date of this election. If we would have had better dialogue, better communication, and quite frankly, better leadership from the governor, we might have had a different situation. The Republicans did not choose on their own to have this election. Any insinuation that that is the case is just wrong. Governor Evers evidently is listening to Tom Perez to make these decisions. He made it political, which is unfortunate. I think as you get to then that 11th hour when Governor Evers takes that unconstitutional act that he said he didn't have the power to do for weeks and cancels the election, and in the lead up to that, when Republicans are considering a special session, they're reaching out to their local officials. They're talking to their clerks. They're talking to their county board members. They're hearing from them, from the clerks, hey, we've got this. We can do this. The election proved that. It went very, very smoothly across the state, except for failed leadership in Milwaukee and Green Bay. They heard from their county board leaders that we have to have an election. So it's really no surprise then that they didn't act in a legislative session to change the date when there wasn't this dialogue that could have occurred, should have occurred all along the way between led by the governor to the legislative leaders. They asked several times, are you going to change the date? Do you want to change the date? And the answer they got was no.
But do you feel like it backfired at all now that you've seen the results?
No, I don't think that people voted based on that. I think what we see here is we have a Democrat primary. I think once we pull the voter file and take a look at exactly who voted, I suspect that we needed to do a better job of activating those solely Trump motivated voters, people who voted for the president in 2016, but sat out 2018. We got them back in 2019. I think we lost them again in the spring of 2020. That's what I think we'll see.
And Ben, we've already talked a little bit about how you felt about having that in-person election. So I know your side on that. And I want to make sure I get time to ask you about the DNC. I mean, where does that stand? Do you think that's still happening possibly, even with the new date?
I want to speak to that. I also just want to let the record be clear. 3 days after issuing the Safer at Home order, Governor Evers called for ballots to be mailed to every Wisconsin voter, an idea that Republicans immediately refused to even consider how to think about doing logistically. Governor Evers filed an amicus brief in federal court in a lawsuit brought by Republican as well as Democratic mayors who signed a letter calling for the election to be moved. The Republican as well as Democratic mayors on the letter, maybe not on the lawsuit itself. This was something we heard from Republicans as well as Democrats as the crisis got worse. And although I know there's a Republican effort to talk about the one majority minority city in Wisconsin as being the one place that had election problems, the fact is Waukesha also only had one polling place, and there were places across the state. We were hearing from clerks, from local elected officials from both parties that they didn't want the election to go forward in person, especially in the final hour. It's, Governor Evers asked Republicans to do a special section. They immediately refused. And we wound up with the kind of Robin Voss, Michael Dukakis in a tank moment where he wore personal protective equipment that should have been in our hospitals, telling people it was incredibly safe to go out and vote after he himself declined to do anything to try to make it safer. I really, this crisis was getting worse and worse and worse as the moment approached, as poll workers dropped out en masse. Changing conditions require a changing response, and that's not what we saw. Now, to that same principle, as we look at the Democratic National Convention, I know that the team working on that is committed to three things. One is to make sure that what takes place in August is going to be safe. The second is to make sure that it successfully launches our Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. And the third is that it be Wisconsin-y. What that means, what it means to have a safe, successful, and Wisconsin-y convention, they're looking at a lot of different scenarios. And I know that they are in constant touch with health experts. They're looking at all the different options. I'm confident that it's going to be great. I hope that the Republicans pay as much attention to the need to protect the public as I know the Democrats will. But at this point, it could go in a number of different directions. So I don't want to get ahead of the careful plans that they're putting together.
Because I guess the question is, if Democrats didn't think it was safe for people to show up to the polling places, do they really think it's safe to have all those people in a room for a convention?
Putting ballots in the mail to everybody gives them the option, no matter what the pandemic conditions are on November 3rd. And I think opening up those options is critical. I will also say every place that has gone to vote by mail, obviously some spent years slowly transitioning, others like Ohio with the Republican legislature and governor have shifted gears to vote by mail in a matter of weeks. Every place that does it always has an option that is very carefully administered for people with language barriers or disabilities to be able to vote in person if needed. And having more options that are all safer is better. I think that a similar principle applies to the convention. They don't need to make a decision now about exactly the form it'll take. The key thing is to have different options so that we can be responsive to the real life conditions when decisions have to be made. Thank you.
So again, on the Democratic National Convention, today or yesterday, we were hearing from the former DNC chair, McAuliffe, that he doesn't think there's going to be a convention in August. And then President or Vice President Biden talking about a virtual convention. And so give me your sense, Ben, on what a virtual convention would do for your efforts. And then Andrew, I know that the convention was going to help Democrats in terms of organizing their base, but I'm sure you were preparing as well to provide the opposing view to that. So if all of this looks different in August, how does that change your game plan, especially if it's a virtual convention?
There has never been a convention for a presidential campaign during a infectious pandemic in the United States. Even during the influenza pandemic elections in 1918, they didn't have a presidential nominating moment. They also didn't have video conferencing technology at that time. So, I think it will be whatever form the convention takes is going to knock people's socks off. But I also think we are in early days to describe exactly what that will look like. The other thing that I'll say is that whatever form the convention takes is going to be a massive event. It will be a uniquely Wisconsin-y event, a Wisconsin-flavored, Milwaukee-centered event. And that will be an opportunity for us to engage people across the country and across the state, to train people in how to do get out the vote organizing. Maybe it's get out the absentee ballot organizing, in how to talk to neighbors and friends and contacts of theirs about Joe Biden and Donald Trump and his failed leadership on coronavirus. We're going to be able to do a massive organizing campaign in any of the scenarios that are possible at this point. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us. Just to follow up,
have you been part of conversations that lay out the scenario of a virtual convention versus I guess it won't be a traditional convention, but some other form?
There's an excellent team at the host committee and the convention committee. They've been working on thinking through the options for them. I have been focused on winning a state Supreme Court race and supporting safe voting for hundreds of thousands of Wisconsin voters who voted by mail for the first time. So I'm sure that conversations will move forward in lots of ways, but my focus really has been on this giant election, first trying to make it safe for people, and then trying, and successfully so, to get enough voters out so that we could win a decisive victory and help the Republicans reconsider their opposition to safe elections in November.
So, Andrew, on your side, the Republicans are still talking about a convention down in North Carolina. Are delegates and Republicans looking forward to gathering in August, given the concerns with coronavirus? And then how would you game plan a big change in Milwaukee if it's not the size and scale of what we originally thought?
Well, I think, I've always been skeptical that that choosing Milwaukee as the convention is going to turn into ballot box success. Democrats traditionally, historically, have not been able to do that. I think it was going to give us a great opportunity to compare and contrast our views and our beliefs with what the Democrats believe. I think we're still going to be able to do that regardless of where that convention is. I suspect if it's more virtual and doesn't have a Milwaukee feel to it, the Wisconsin will take less of a role in that. But certainly if it's in Milwaukee or centered in Milwaukee, we will absolutely take a role and make sure that we do our part to contrast what the Democrats are talking about and believe versus what we believe in. I haven't talked to anybody about Charlotte, given that it is in Charlotte. We're going through our process, probably like Ben is, to select delegates, making sure that we do all of those things. We had to adapt to how we do that, and we did that. So we're prepared for a convention, regardless of how it is on our side or how it looks.
Craig?
So Ben, it sounds like you're asking for two things that Republicans in the legislature do not support and are unlikely to make changes to law to happen, which are an all-mail election and mailing ballots to all registered voters. Setting that aside, do you think this election is going to have sort of permanent ramifications for how people vote? Do you think it's going to change people's voting habits with respect to mail going forward, even after we get through this pandemic? And how are the parties, and how is your party planning for that?
So the first time for anything is always the hardest. And voting by mail is, alien to millions of Wisconsinites who have gone with their parents since they were children, like I did. I grew up going to the Judge Monroe Building, Winger School, with my mom to vote, and I took my kids to vote there in 2019. And now I voted from home. My wife voted from home. My parents voted from home. I think there are tons of people who are going to vote from home. And I think that is actually a good thing for democracy. Voting from home, people spend more time thinking through all the different candidates. There's research suggesting that they research candidates more. They're more likely to fill out the entire ballot. And I think it's critical to vote all the way up and down. We don't have straight ticket voting here, but up and down the ballot. I think that what we've seen is people kind of broke through the barrier and are going to do this more often. Now, I don't know if the same level is going to hold if in a post-COVID-19 world, but frankly, so many things are going to be changed, and we don't know how long different kinds of changes in our own lives are going to take hold. So in Wisconsin, the whole 7th congressional district will have another election on May 12th. I think there'll be a huge amount of mail voting for that. And then August, then November, and then we go into the state superintendent's race in the spring of 2021. If people do something over and over and it's successful, I do think that will change their behavior. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to figure out, in politics, you usually focus just on winning the election. I think we should all focus now on how to win the election and protect the public's health. I really do think that's going to change how we organize, how we mobilize. I think Trump's tweets saying, "Go vote" on April 7th were not helpful in this regard. And as people experience having someone in their own families get sick with coronavirus, potentially die, as we find out what happened on April 7th in terms of exposure to infection, I think the conversation is likely to change. I wouldn't treat the Republican opposition to voting by mail now as necessarily a permanent fixed feature. As Andrew said, if you have enough lead time, it's possible to make shifts. And I hope that Republicans recognize that.
Andrew, assuming there's an increased appetite on the part of people to vote by mail and or an increased need if the pandemic is still with us in the same way in November, are there a few sort of concrete steps that you can imagine Republicans getting behind to make it easier. I mean, obviously, it was a painful transition trying to convert to mostly mail voting essentially overnight. So are there things that you can imagine Republicans supporting, whether it's changes to state law or whether it's simply giving more resources to local clerks, opening the window for mail voting? Are there specific steps you can imagine Republicans supporting?
Well, I think Republicans will support, increased absentee activity. I haven't talked to the leadership about that, but certainly they were very active in encouraging absentee ballots. I think if we're going to see any changes, what I'm hoping for is that we have an early dialogue about it. On March 20th, Governor Evers was saying, we're going to have this election on this date. We're not going to change it. So if that changed so rapidly and can change so rapidly, then we need to have more of a dialogue from the governor on where he's going and what he's going to do. So I think first, encouraging absentee ballots, more absentee ballots. I think as a party, we're going to look at expanding our absentee application program, certainly from what it was, and expand that. But I can't stress enough that this governor on the 20th of March was still talking about, of course, we're going to have the election on this date, and asking for ballots to be mailed to everybody that is not saying we can't have this election. That is putting forward a proposal that even the elections commissioner director said we can't do.
I saw a line in some of the national reporting that said, no more Wisconsin nice. And the article was basically talking about how people might look at us as the Midwest and everyone can get along, but lately it really hasn't seemed that way with all these last minute court rulings and lawsuits in a very partisan fight this most recent election. So I'm wondering, how do party relations stand right now? Ben, if you want to go first.
At a personal level, Andrew and I text each other and we're okay. I also think at a political level, there is a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger, and I can't speak for the Republican side. I think for Democrats, feeling as though they were screaming that we needed to make this election safe, that the governor was calling for a special session and trying to use emergency powers, that our party was in court, and that the Republican National Committee was and Wisconsin GOP was in court trying to shut off access to absentee ballots, trying to prevent even the 6-day extension to get those ballots returned. That felt profoundly wrong. There's a term in psychology called moral injury that refers to the sense of watching something that you can't prevent, that just goes against your fundamental moral beliefs and expectations of how the world should work. And so many people had that sensation in Wisconsin and across the country. It felt like a fundamental breakage. No matter the timeline, it is never too late to do the right thing. And I was hoping against hope that Republicans would take action on an emergency basis in those final days to try to make this election safe. And they can still do that for May 12th. This is still happening right now. I do think it is hard for people to stomach what they saw. And I do think that part of what we saw on April 7th was a backlash to a sense that there was a deep affront to our kind of common humanity, our common product of getting through this coronavirus pandemic. So I do think that there was a reaction, a kind of a backlash against that helped shape the election results. I don't want to repeat that, even if it generated more votes for Democrats. I don't want that to happen again on May 12th, on August 11th, or November 3rd. And I think that we'll be able to kind of bridge some of those partisan divides and be on a sounder footing when it feels like we're all in this together in the face of a crisis that can kill people no matter their political beliefs, the color of their skin. It's disproportionately landing on African Americans and on Democrats right now. This is a threat to everyone, and we've got to tackle it together.
Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, like Ben said, he and I get along really well, despite the fact that we don't agree on much. I think we probably both notice that we start usually every conversation about our kids. And that, I think, is a good place for Ben and I to do, to start. I think I'm a firm believer in communication and being able to sit down and have a beer and talk about things, even with people you disagree with and people on the other side. Equally, like like Ben and Democrats clearly were upset about things that were taking place. Republicans were also upset, very upset that that the governor would say he didn't have the power to do this, and then at the last minute does it and changes the election when we could have had a discussion about it and should have a discussion about it. That is an affront to the Constitution. That concerns us. The United States Supreme Court, the one thing that guided clearly the United States Supreme Court, decades of precedent, they said you don't change election rules on the eve of an election. That's what guided the United States Supreme Court. That's what guided me in the decision making we made with court decisions. I think also we've heard about this backlash in terms of whether or not that pushed more Democrats to the polls. There's also another backlash going on in Wisconsin, and that has to do with when is the state going to open up again. And Governor Evers has been talking a lot about the shutdown part of it, but he hasn't communicated the how we're going to go open back up, when we're going to open back up, what factors, what do we need, what tools, resources do we need to open back up. And I think there are a lot of people in Wisconsin, especially outstate rural Wisconsin, that are very concerned about what the government is doing right now. And, that I think had something to do too with having this election when at the 11th hour, the governor calls for a change. He calls for this change, even though he doesn't have the power to do it. There isn't communication. We're not seeing communication from him like we see with the president, daily press conferences. We'd like to see some of those things so that we can see where he's going and where he's headed. That's some of the things that upset Republicans leading up to this election. At the end of the day, politics is politics, and this is a Dem primary. They were able to turn out more votes, not all that surprising. It was an uphill battle. I wish we could have overcome it, but we didn't.
But you're saying the things that you feel like Democrats did wrong. So how do you characterize the relationship, I guess, right now, Republicans and Democrats in Wisconsin? I mean, is it bad? Is it strained? What would you use to describe it?
Well, I think I don't know that you could describe it anything more than strained since the beginning of the Evers administration. I think communication is what is needed. I'm not trying to be disparaging to the governor right now, but when legislative leaders ask, are you going to change the date? Do you want to change the date? And they're told no from the governor. And then this transpires at the 11th hour without a conversation about we have to change the date. That's a problem. Yes, he talked about mail balloting and sending ballots to everybody. That's very different than having a conversation 2 or 3 weeks out that we've got to change the date of this thing. So I think strained, but with better communication, maybe we could improve it.
So let me follow up on that. We're expecting to hear from the governor today at a 1:30 news conference. He may give us some guidance on how they're going to reopen or if there's any movement towards that. But give me a sense. In 2016, Democrats will always remember that Hillary Clinton did not come to the state of Wisconsin to campaign after Labor Day. Given that we don't know where we're going to be come September, October, and November, whether we have a vaccine, whether people are still comfortable going to large events, Wisconsin is a retail politics state. Are you planning for events that will look more virtual than the traditional campaign of speeches and coming together and holding large rallies? At this point, and Andrew, I think you'll be first on this, how will you attempt to do campaigning if we're still in this situation?
Yeah, great question, Charles. I can tell you that the Trump campaign and the Trump victory apparatus changed to virtual work almost immediately. That's something that we have to adjust our whole strategy to, because we have this neighborhood team model that's very much reliant upon person-to-person interaction. So that strategy has to take an adjustment, but we will see a number of virtual events. We're already doing virtual events every week with the Trump campaign as we move forward here. So you're going to see those events grow. You're going to see those events grow with more surrogates, more popular surrogates, like the president himself. Those are the things that I think we're going to see throughout this time period as we continue. And I mean, I think everybody hopes that we can get back to the retail politics that we know Wisconsinites are used to and that they love. I know I do. I'm sure Ben does. I think we all want to get back to that, but we're all making plans for this virtual world that we're living in right now.
Ben?
Very similar. We've been doing, I think every day for the last several weeks, we've had at least one Zoom video conference event, town halls, trainings, webinars. We've been connecting with volunteers and supporters across the country. And most importantly, here in Wisconsin, our neighborhood teams, we provided support for all of our neighborhood action teams, which I know the Republican Party is now also building to be able to operate on Zoom and virtually. And we're training people on how to do things like sending peer-to-peer text messages and using virtual phone banks, especially helping people virtually phone bank people in their own communities. That's just different from what our emphasis has been. In normal times, knocking on someone's door and having a conversation is the most powerful tactic available. I don't think that's true right now. People don't want to go out and knock, and nobody would open the door if they did. So I think the same principle kind of applies to the large rallies, all the theatrics of a presidential campaign. Our number one priority has to be across the aisle, making sure that we're not endangering people for participating in democracy. But other than that, this is a real period of innovation and of testing to find out the things that are most effective to motivate, mobilize, persuade people in a virtual environment. And I think we've invented a bunch of new stuff in the last few weeks alone, and I think it's the pace of innovation is just going to keep rising because the stakes are so high in Wisconsin, maybe more than any other place in the country.
I hate to go out of turn, but I want to make sure you guys see this breaking news. I just got an email about it that the DNC Milwaukee Host Committee has reduced staff by more than half now through layoffs and transfers. So I wanted to make sure before we got off this call, Craig, don't mean to cut you off and go before you, but I just wanted to kind of get a response to that by cutting the host committee from both of you.
The course of planning the convention is obviously changing substantially. The convention is later on, so in ramping up for a convention in July, it's different from ramping up for a convention in August. And if there's not a convention with the same tens of thousands of people all coming in, you plan something very different. So I think the host committee is adapting to the shifting situation to make sure that it's doing the most effective thing to launch our nominee.
And I would say, it's the impact of coronavirus is obviously hitting both parties, both campaigns, both conventions. So everybody is doing the best they can to make sure that they can plan and pull off a convention that's meaningful, that resonates with the American people, and speaks to them. So it doesn't surprise me that there are changes. I don't know that I would read much into it, except for the fact that these are changing times that all of us are trying to figure out.
Andrew, you talked about a brewing backlash with respect to the question of reopening the state. Are you saying that you just want to see the governor communicate more about when to do that, or are you saying he's taking too long to reopen the state?
So as I've talked with people around the state, there's just a concern about where we are going, how long it's going to take to get there, what factors, how many tests do we need in order to have comfort with reopening. It's a mix. There are some people across the state who are very upset and want it reopened now. There are some people that just want information. I think, across the board, if we take a step back, I think the one thing that we should all consider and acknowledge is we can't necessarily paint the whole state with one paintbrush. perhaps, not even the country with one paintbrush. What's happening in New York City is different in terms of now and time frame, and the potential is different than what's happening in Milwaukee. And what's happening in Milwaukee in terms of now or the potential is probably different than what's going to happen or could happen in Hayward. So if we're going to, as we move forward, if we could have a discussion about different approaches for different parts of the state, have more communication, I think that would go a long way. A daily press conference from the governor to hear what is the plan, what is the latest of what's going on, I think would give a lot of people comfort. Not approaching it from a partisan manner. I have the experience of when I worked for Governor Walker. I did kind of the emergency management work, the liaison work out of the governor's office. I thought a lot about how the Governor Walker would be handling this. It would be, I think, a lot more press, a lot more discussion going on. And I know he would have been telling me to be calling local leaders all over the state, local officials all over the state, businesses around the state, to understand what's going on. I think the president did a great thing by forming that task force of business leaders around the country. That would be a good thing for us to do in Wisconsin too.
Okay, I'm back. Hi, everybody. It's been a very interesting discussion. We're going to now switch to some audience questions. So hang on, everybody, and then we'll say thanks at the end. But I do have some questions from the audience. And somebody asked the question about who's to blame here, the post office or the rolling deadlines on absentee ballots for all the confusion in terms of postmarks and all that, which left some people, some people's ballots not delivered or not counted, we think. I mean, who's to blame for that? Let's start with Andrew.
So, I would use it as an example of why we shouldn't have judges changing the law. Judge Connolly, look, I understand he thought that it was the right thing to do, but this is why we don't want activist judges, as I would say. We don't want people who are moving the date. We don't want judges moving the date of requesting an absentee ballot. It got so close to election day that put so much pressure on the postal system, which obviously something went wrong there. Had we more time, some of those things may not have happened, at least not to that extent. So I don't know if you can blame one single person.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The governor has just issued a news release saying that he will extend Safer at Home to May 26th. So this will have enormous implications on the May election for up in the Northwest. Wanted to get your reaction to that because you've been talking about looking for some guidance here.
Okay, so go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I think again, we see a lot from, and I obviously haven't had the opportunity to read the press release or hear any news coverage or see any news coverage on it. My criticism, my constructive criticism is we continue to see one side. We're talking about shutting down longer. What I'd like to see, what I think Republicans would like to see, is the other side of the coin. How are we going to open back up? What are the rules that are going to govern it? What are the factors that are going to govern it? We've got a lot of people who are in a lot of trouble because the government has shut us down for so long. And that is concerning. People are going to be concerned about that. They're going to have to make decisions about, do they keep their business open? Do they pay their employees? It's not fake money. It's not monopoly money. It's real life. And so we need to have better communication. I hope that when I read this press release, it talks about how are we going to open back up? When are we going to open back up? What factors are going to govern us in this decision? The governor owes that to Wisconsinites.
Okay, Ben, why don't you comment on the longer stay-at-home order, and then we can pivot to the answer to the question from the audience.
Sure. I know that what guides our governor's decision-making about coronavirus is what should guide everyone's, which is how to protect the public's health and how to balance all the urgent needs that we have. We are in a massive economic crisis, and what every economist and public health expert says and has found through extensive study is that the sooner you deal with a pandemic, the better it is for the economy. If you take half measures, if you pull back too soon, then you wind up with a new bump of coronavirus infections, and people stop trusting government guidance about when it's safe to go out. So you actually wind up in a worse situation where people aren't willing to go out, even if the government says that it's okay. And I know that there are people working around the clock to make sure that people are kept safe and to try to help people meet their urgent economic needs at the same time, so that we can move into something closer to regular life afterwards as soon as possible. I look forward to the guidance about what the specific triggers will be. And I also know that there's a deeply concerning effort by some groups on the far right to try to push people and say that coronavirus death counts have been overstated and this is a made up emergency and you should go out right now. We saw this protest that was funded in part by the DeVos family in Michigan against Governor Whitmer there. I really hope we don't get into that kind of situation in Wisconsin. The number one, the North Star for all of us has to be, how do we deal with this pandemic, keep our economic kind of blood flowing through our system without making massive cuts that hurt people, and then get back on our feet.
Okay, so let's just ask you both chairs point blank, should the May 12th election go forward in the special election for the 7th Congressional District? Go ahead, Ben. Should the May 12th election go forward?
My view is that we should switch it to an all-mail election and take whatever time we need. To Andrew's point, if it requires more time to make that work functionally so that people can vote safely without fear of infection, then we should get that extra time. The most important thing is to not force anyone to choose between potential exposure to COVID and casting a ballot.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, and I would say what we need is discussion. We need very quick discussion on this. The stay-at-home order has been issued now over that time period, just like we had on April 7th. I would say we absolutely need discussion. Please don't wait to the last minute, Governor. We need to understand where you're going, what you want to do, have that dialogue. And with that dialogue, I'm confident that we can get to a good answer here. And so that's what I would encourage is a honest, sincere, early upfront dialogue on what we're going to do. It's not fair to the voters. It's also not fair to the campaigns and the people who support these campaigns, because then you have both sides not knowing what's going to happen. They're running down their bank accounts, banking on that May 12th date, and then they get to it and it changes at the last minute. And then they have to all of a sudden try to replenish their bank accounts, replenish how they're going to do their campaign. We just need an answer early on this one.
What about your state convention, Andrew?
What was that, Jeff?
What about your state convention?
So we've been working on that and making contingency plans for a number of weeks now. Our convention committee has been doing that, looking at alternatives under the possibility that this would happen. So we're in a good spot. Probably be able to have an announcement for you soon on that. But like I'm sure Ben did, took early action to make sure what are the contingency plans, what is constitutionally required on our state party constitution, how do we get that done? Just good planning and good communication with our folks.
All right, here's a final question. I think we're running out of time.
Hey, Jeff, I'm sorry, I'm going to need to jump off just to chase down this new information.
Sure, go ahead, Charles. It's a dynamic situation. You're relieved of your duties.
All right.
Take care, Charles.
Bye-bye, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Charles.
But another audience question, and then we'll close it up. All the lawsuits that occurred before, and then there was a lawsuit filed just this week. So I think there seems to be, the election doesn't seem to be quite over. And what are the lessons going to be learned from this election to avoid the confusion for the big election in November? So that's maybe a way to draw the loop on all this. Why don't we start with Ben on that one?
Sure. To an earlier question, it's clear that thousands of people were disenfranchised in this election. There are thousands of people who, according to the official system, never received an absentee ballot who requested one. I have been texted countless photos from people who got their absentee ballot in the mail the day after it wound up being due, thanks to the United States Supreme Court and the RNC's lawsuit. There were people who requested their ballots weeks early that never arrived. There was a lot that went wrong. And I don't regret urging people to vote by mail, even if there were glitches in the system, because that was the safer option to do. But there's no question that more planning, more dialogue and conversation is needed to figure out how to get this right. And Andrew, I welcome your suggestion. Let the conversation begin. I think gaveling in and out from a special session in 17 seconds, rather than having even a conversation about what to do in that session, didn't represent the kind of dialogue we need, nor the lame duck session after Governor Evers was elected to strip him of his powers. But I hope that Robin Vos and Scott Fitzgerald will come to the table and have the kind of conversation we need to be able to get this right. It's not just Democrats or Republicans, it's our democracy that's on the line for us changing the way that we vote to adapt to new situations and new circumstances. There are things, as we have learned during this hour, things that we didn't predict that will happen in the course of any particular day, and we'll have to sometimes act quickly. But when we can plan long ahead, and we have 6.5 months till November, we have time to change and not repeat the shameful disaster that took place with people risking infection with coronavirus to cast their votes last Tuesday. So I'm hopeful that we find a new day, that even with the bitterness that we've seen across the state, that we find a way to have those conversations across party lines and pass a bipartisan vote the way we just did on our coronavirus package. That was, I think, 97-0 in the Assembly, and I think unanimous in the Senate, signed by the governor. Let's do that on democracy too. And then we can duke it out over the issues the way we were supposed to do.
Okay, Andrew, what about all these legal challenges, and how do we make sure that that's not the case in November?
Well, I think, rather than have all of these legal challenges and lawsuit after lawsuit, it would be better if we took that time to plan and get ready for this situation. The governor, I think calling that special session, at the 8th hour and then at the 11th hour, issuing that executive order, it drove and has led to a nice narrative for the Democrats, but it's not reality of what happened. The reality of what happened is the governor was very late to leadership here, if leadership at all. And so going forward, we need to have more communication early, earlier decision making. Those lawsuits, Ben talked about the United States Supreme Court decision. I didn't bring any of those lawsuits. The left brought those lawsuits, and the court overwhelmingly said the one thing that guided the court was don't change the election laws on the eve of elections. That is bad for democracy. That is the theme. That is the overarching theme and controlling precedent of that decision. Hopefully going forward, we can have early, better communication, calling for a special session at the 8th hour and executive order at the 11th hour. That's not leadership, and it's not good communication.
Okay, so we're running up against the clock, and there's breaking news to be had. So, the Milwaukee Press Club and WisPolitics.com and all of you have to get moving on. But I want to thank everybody who was part of this today, especially the state chairs, Andrew Hitt from the GOP and Ben Wikler from the Democratic Party. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you to Charles Benson, who is out and about already from TMJ4, Craig Gilbert from the Journal Sentinel, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and Adrian Peterson from WISN TV and the Upfront program, and our sponsors as well, Spectrum News One, More Communications for the Milwaukee Press Club and for the WisPolitics.com Milwaukee series, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Medical College of Wisconsin, Waggett, the firm Consulting, Milwaukee Police Association, and Spectrum. So thank you, everybody. And we have another program on Tuesday from WisPolitics.com on Earth Day, the next 50 years. You can find out more about that at WisPolitics.com. And then the Milwaukee Press Club and WisPolitics will join for another one of these a week from today with Milwaukee Police Chief Morales. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.